I'm gonna get going because we're already at
Yeah.
12:05 almost. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll probably have some stragglers who went to the auditorium first and then
Yeah, that was me.
oh, okay. Thank you for coming all the way up. Hopefully there's more, but I'm really excited to introduce Tyson Terry. He's a new faculty member to SOS, joint with School of Life Sciences, and he started in January. So when I say new, pretty darn new. So less than 4 months or so. And he's going to share his research connected to his work in dryland plant and ecology. He's starting up a lab there over in School of Life Sciences, but has obviously a joint appointment here, and really excited to see what he's going to talk about, and apparently has some really nice photos. Tyson has said it's okay to ask clarifying questions throughout the talk and then hold like the bigger questions till the end of the. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Tyson Terry. I'm a new assistant professor. I think this is a fun opportunity. My hiring process was a bit chaotic. I don't think most of you were able to come to much of my research presentation at that point. I don't think a lot of people were able to come. So this is maybe a second chance for you to get to know my research interests and kind of the questions that I'm considering. So yeah, today I'm talking about plant patterns in world of drought, fire, and warming. These are often discussed separately, but today I'm going to maybe bring them a little bit more together to help us understand how our plant ecosystems are going to respond to these global changes. So today we're going to start with plant adaptations and response. We're going to talk a little bit about how these plant communities usually respond to variability in climate and resources. Then we'll get into climate trends, what's happening in the West. Obviously, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you some things that I think are important. And then finally, we'll tie it all together to say, how do these changes in climate and the adaptations to the plants, how does that all come together to kind of form what our current systems are and what they may be in the future? So this talk, I'm a dryland plant ecologist, as was mentioned. I don't know everything about all the plants, despite everybody that I meet that I tell them I'm a plant ecologist and they start asking me questions about their garden. I focus mostly on dryland systems, specifically here in the West. This is a beautiful area. I love it. I grew up here and now I live here for hopefully forever. And yeah, this is a cool place that has a lot of history. We have a lot of Native American history in this area, and we also have kind of more modern dynamics happening with westward expansion. So I can only imagine what it would have been like to come west after living in maybe the eastern US and see these big open landscapes, right? It was seen as by westward expansioners as like this place of opportunity, right? This big open space. You can do agriculture here. You can put livestock on the land. So really these big open spaces that are quite different from other locations. And these can look very different. We have systems like the sagebrush steppe. This is a big component of the Western US, encompassing a lot of Nevada, parts of Utah, parts of California, parts of Oregon and Idaho, Wyoming. This is what we often call a cold desert. So this is where the majority of the rainfall occurs during the cold season, during the winter, and often comes in the form of snow. This slowly infiltrates into the soil, and then in the spring you get a lot more activity. You also get more moisture. So it's a beautiful system. They often call it the sagebrush sea, which is a fun term. You think of the ocean as pretty homogeneous in a way. It's just a lot of water, but there's a lot happening in different components of the water, and that's the same for the sagebrush steppe. A lot of sagebrush here, as you can see, but there's a lot happening in between as far as biogeochemical activity and diversity of plants and animals. Another example would be the Mojave Desert. Here you can see the Joshua tree, maybe the mascot of the Mojave Desert. Beautiful plant, but again, characterized by big open spaces. This is a warmer system, considered a warm desert. They don't get a lot of snow here, and it's also seen as a bit drier. And then our home, the Sonoran Desert, which different mascot, the saguaro cactus, and lots of other perennial vegetation. Pretty common here that the vegetation is dominated by perennial long-lived species. But yeah, really beautiful place. So these are all what we call drylands. Drylands is a fun category or classification of arid systems. So there's differing levels of aridity. As you can see on this map, you have hyper-arid systems, semi-arid systems, subhumid systems. And the aridity is determined by precipitation inputs and then the evaporative outputs or removal. So this ratio is used usually to define these categories and if it is a dryland. So drylands typically are classified as places where the evaporative demands of the atmosphere exceed the precipitation inputs by 150%. So there's a lot of forces trying to pull water out of these systems, and the plant communities have to be quite creative, and it's fun to see the strategies that they've evolved to maximize water use and deal with what little they have. So these are very diverse systems. I showed you a couple, but this also extends into savanna systems in Africa and grassland systems in steppe type areas like the Tibetan Plateau. But all of these, despite their differences, share the uniform attribute of water limitation. So I made a bunch of figures on ChatGPT this round. Some of them are better than others. This is one depicting the law of the minimum. So this is the same thing as a limiting resource, limiting reagent for growth. So you can imagine a barrel in this case, and I believe these individual wooden components are called staves. Nobody corrects me, then I'll just keep saying they're staves. So the stave height, or these individual components, determine how much water can be held in this barrel. So you can imagine a similar analogy, but this is plant growth, how much occurs and what type. And no matter how much additional water you put into this barrel, it's going to continue to leak out of the lowest component, right? So even if we add more nitrogen, more light, more temperature, more energy, it's not going to change the outcome much because of this limiting reagent, the minimum. So this is the common factor across drylands, that they share this water limitation. I will give a plug for nutrients here, that there is some evidence that there's a bit of co-limitation in drylands with nutrients, as they play an important role in helping plants modify their water use efficiency. So drylands, they're dry. How do the plants deal with it? One particular component of drylands is a lot of variability. You can have one year that's wet and then one year that's very dry. And this is kind of a unique attribute to drylands, where in many other systems, things seem to be a bit more stable. And so how do you overcome that? Well, here's just a couple of examples of how dryland plants have dealt with volatility and variability in resources and climate in the past. One is seed banks. So One option is to produce seeds that can then go into the soil and remain there until the conditions are favorable. There's evidence that plants will modify the amount of hormones in these seeds to delay their growth or their germination at different levels. So kind of hedging bets, producing seeds that will germinate at very different times, and maybe one of them is in a good period. And if so, great, then you get a successful plant. So this is kind of one example of how plants can deal with volatility in climate. The other is kind of a theme that we'll be talking about more today, which is this spectrum of plant functional traits that are tied to growth strategy. Is something acquisitive or conservative? Conservative being the hair in the conservative being the tortoise in the tortoise and the hare analogy, right? So you've got slow growth species and then fast growth species, and you get a bit of a spectrum in drylands. So for example, we've got a shrub there. This looks like a sagebrush, but it could just as well be a mesquite or a creosote bush. These are conservative growth forms that they grow really slowly. And because they grow slowly, they don't respond as quickly to shifts in resources. So, for example, it has woody plant tissue, right? You can't evaporate water as quickly out of woody tissue as you can fleshy, green, photosynthetic tissue. So we see with most of these shrubs, really small leaf areas and woody plant material. This reduces the amount of evaporation that can go out, but it also reduces the amount of photosynthesis that can happen. So it can't be generating so much carbon for growth and for reproduction as maybe a different plant that can respond to those bumps. Also, it's got, most shrubs have a deeper rooting strategy. So the roots go deeper, which provides access to more consistent soil water. It's less inconsistent, but also it's usually not an extreme amount of water, and it's a little bit harder to get. But altogether, this strategy produces really slow incremental growth that seems somewhat indifferent to annual changes in weather. On the other side of the spectrum, the more acquisitive side, we could imagine this grass that's in between the shrub and the deeper rooted perennial grass. It's a little yellow. This has a shallower rooting system, so it's really vulnerable to annual weather patterns. If you get a big dump of rain, then that water is going to become highly available in those upper layers. It's going to take much longer to trickle down. But however, even though you may get really high inputs, you also have that high variability that due to evaporation, that water can disappear really quickly and become very dry. So it becomes important for the species to really explode in growth, produce seeds, and grow during times of feast, and then often dies back a lot during times of famine. So you get these two different strategies, and then there's a kind of a gradient here that you have some species that are also deep-rooted, but are more receptive to rainfall than others. So it's really a spectrum of growth strategies. So now we'll get into a little bit of climate trends. What is happening here in the West, especially in these dryland systems. And the big one that everybody talks about, and rightfully so, is the atmosphere. So we have warming that's occurring, and so you can see it's a pretty obvious trend. This has been tied to greenhouse gas emissions, and so CO2 and methane, seen here, CO2 on top and methane on the bottom. But you can see the strong tie to vegetation activity in these little oscillations, right? You look at it, it almost looks like an EKG or like a heartbeat or something. And this is due to the land masses, right? In the northern hemisphere, we have big land mass. In the southern hemisphere, we have less. And so the vegetation activity that's driving carbon sinks and sources changes depending on the season. So winter versus summer, you're going to get more carbon being fixated into plants and also sources of CO2 through respiration or methane through decomposition. So what does this warming actually do? Well, I'm going to talk about a few things. One is it can shift the seasons a little bit. Another, it can change soil moisture levels. And it can also change the volatility of the hydrological cycle. So one example of seasonal changes is it can change growing season length. It can also cause more intense summers. So here's a figure from a publication that I'm working on that's looking at growing season length and how it has changed over time. And the paper goes on to talk about implications of urbanization and agriculture land use and how that modifies. But here you can see pretty clearly that there are pretty large changes happening to the growing season. It's shifting quite a bit. Drylands are unfortunately excluded from a lot of this due to the difficulty in monitoring vegetation in drylands from satellites. But fortunately, I think we're overcoming a lot of those issues, and hopefully we'll be able to detect more phenology from satellites in the future. But general sense of lengthening growing seasons and more intense summers. I did a more in-depth study a while back on soil moisture and soil temperature patterns, specifically relating to seed germination. So this is a study in the sagebrush steppe, looking at 15 sites over about 30 years and looking at the water potential. So on this graph, values that are higher mean that it's wetter, and values that are lower mean that it's drier. And these values are from 2004 to 2017. And then it's an anomaly compared to the values from 1980 to 2004. So what we can see here is that the summer dates are much drier. But we also see that potentially the fall and the spring may be a little wetter. So this just goes to show that it's not so simple. Warming doesn't just mean drying or just mean warmer temperatures, but it can also alter seasonal dynamics. You may get a shift in resource availability depending on how it's interacting with soils and the jet stream and all of these different patterns. This is a great metaphor for how warming is likely to alter the hydrological budget and system across the globe. If we can think of the atmosphere as a sponge, then we can start to understand a little bit about what warmer temperatures mean for water. And we can imagine a scenario where the smaller sponge is us now. So right now, the atmosphere both demands water through evaporative pressure, and then it also provides water through precipitation. So this sponge is sucking up and then letting go, sucking up, letting go. But under warmer temperatures, this sponge increases in size. So the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship shows that for every 1 degree Celsius of warming in the atmosphere, you see an increase of 7% in water content in the atmosphere. So 1 degree Celsius warming means 7% more precipitation capacity in the atmosphere. And this can translate into more variable precipitation, right? something that's able to suck up more water but also provide more, can lead to these kind of patterns within the year. So black bars represent maybe a historic distribution of rainfall, and blue represent more modern. So within this 1 year, or growing season in this case, historically maybe you had lots of smaller events, so frequent small rainfall events. But with this bigger sponge, it shifts to fewer, larger events. So some people call this a more intense precipitation regime. And then also is variability between years, interannual variability. And what you can imagine is in the past, year-to-year variability, there was variability, but maybe not so much as we're seeing now. So wet and dry years weren't so different versus now, maybe you have a year where, as recently seen, the monsoon doesn't come versus a year where the monsoon is really intense and provides a lot of precipitation. So these phenomenon are becoming more variable. The amount of precipitation in the year is becoming more variable, and its distribution within the year. And this can be seen as whiplash. This is also a ChatGPT figure, the conceptual figure. These are actual data on the right. So this variability can lead to whiplash, right? Where you get really dry conditions followed immediately or in close temporal proximity with heavy wet conditions. And as I mentioned, drylands are really responsive to water. This is the key component that's driving vegetation trends. And so it's really important to look at this. And so this Nature Review paper that recently came out actually quantified this whiplash. They calculated the frequency of when a extreme dry event and an extreme wet event were in close proximity. So they did this within the year and then across years. So on the top, you can see over time that the frequency of whiplash events has increased substantially over the last 30, 40 years. These are global data too. This isn't just drylands, but it's definitely felt in drylands quite impactfully. What we do see is a little bit more of an increasing trend within year versus across years, but you get the point. Things are getting a little chaotic. To better understand this, I have this ongoing project called Precipitation Evenness. This is looking at quantifying intra-annual patterns. So we talked about how things may be evenly, or how precipitation may be distributed within the year. How do we quantify that? And people kind of struggled to quantify it beyond just talking about average event size versus frequency. But here I use a Gini index. There's probably some economists in here, so they may know Gini better than I do, but this is basically looking at the evenness of the distribution of precipitation. I will add this as an unranked Gini index. And so we'll walk through two scenarios. One on the top is what I would consider an even precipitation pattern. We have a bunch of events, but they happen relatively evenly across time. The amount of precipitation comes in frequent, medium-sized events. If you look over on the right with the cumulative precipitation, you see this little bumps over time with each event. And this is pretty close to this 1-to-1 line. So a very even distribution of precipitation with this year. This other year, which has the same amount of precipitation, but different temporal packaging, translates into a very different pattern. So we have more variable amounts, more variable frequency, and what we see is a really big difference. There's maybe a long period of dryness that was preceded by really wet period and then maybe followed by a wet period. And we quantify this by calculating the gray area on the right graphs, which is basically the difference between the 1-to-1 line and the actual precipitation pattern. And if you project this across space, especially the Western US, we see that most places are getting less even precipitation. So precipitation is arriving in bigger, less frequent events than before. But there are areas that are also seeing the opposite, where it's becoming a bit more evenly distributed. They're getting smaller storms, smaller, more frequent storms than before. So as we kind of start to wrap up the climate section, I want you to mind everything that's happening here. We've talked about precipitation, but how that precipitation translates into water stress for plants or resource availability for plants is going to depend on lots of things. The amount of evaporation that happens, the soil characteristics, how deep is the soil, what's the texture of the soil, is there a canopy that's intercepting precipitation? There's a lot that goes into understanding drought, if you will. And I think this study did a good job of showing that. Basically what they do here is they look at meteorological drought versus edaphic drought or soil drought. And as you can see across all of these systems, here they're just looking at the number of dry days. And if you look at the meteorological data, the atmospheric data, it seems like, okay, the number of dry days is not really changing much over time. This is the change in dry days over time. So meteorologically, not a lot of activity, but when we look into the soils, we see that there's actually quite a bit of change happening that we may be missing if we don't look at the whole picture. Okay, part 3, this is plants plus climate. How do these two come together? We talked about adaptations and now climate. So let's see how they come together. Well, under historic conditions, I kind of already talked about this. We have plant growth forms that are indifferent and some plant forms that are really sensitive to changes in climate. But having a gradient has provided a relatively stable plant ecosystem that offers forage and habitat to wildlife and livestock, and also helps with agriculture. What about with changing climate? So what we're seeing with this volatility is kind of this fork in the road. What we're seeing is that this volatile hydrological phenomenon is really leaves space for two types of growth forms, and they are the hyper-acquisitive and the hyper-conservative. And so basically, what we're seeing in our systems today is a shift towards these two systems. We're also seeing amplified variability of herbaceous plant growth. That's because herbaceous plants are really vulnerable. They're the acquisitive side of the spectrum, so they're responding to these climate changes. So to kind of show you how this is happening or how it can happen, here's an experiment where they modified precipitation. So they sometimes they use rainout shelters, and in this case, they used rainout shelters on one year, and then they did precipitation addition on other years. So they're increasing the interannual variability of water in the system. And what they saw was that the shrub species liked it. They increased in their cover and their growth, and the grass species did not do as well. So here's an example of how changing climate is really beneficial to conservative species, but it's also really conservative to annual plant life forms that are able to capitalize on really short periods of favorable conditions. It also can complicate reproduction for plants. So plants that reproduce by seed, they use environmental cues, usually water and temperature, to tell them, to indicate when they should germinate and grow. And it's really important that they time it right, because if they come too early or too late, they may miss the pulse of moisture that happens every year. Maybe it's spring, maybe it's winter, maybe it's the monsoon. And if they miss that, it can be really drastic for their survival. But also it leads to more intense conditions for seedlings. Even if they time it right, they may have a really difficult summer that follows. And if you're a very small seedling, you don't have much in the way of physical structures or carbon stores to be able to counteract those. So here this is a study where we were looking at germination conditions, here called seedbed favorability. This is the quantity of warm and wet conditions. And again, like I was saying earlier, with seasonal changes, we see that the dotted line, which is the historic pattern, is different from the newer line, the solid line, in that summers are more intense, but also there's this period of wet and warm activity that's happening in the fall that didn't happen before. Again, this is in the sagebrush steppe, a colder system, and this fall germination can be really impactful for germination timing. So using germination models, we can even see how this is likely to impact plant germination in field conditions. So over time, we see this really variable germination timing. Some years the species germinate early, some years they germinate late, but in more recent conditions, things seem to be germinating early pretty consistently. So now we're going to talk about changing climate and invasive plants. So three main points that I'm going to talk about quickly are climate change is enhancing invasion of exotic grasses and novel fire regimes, remove conservative growth, and then plant growth variability. We expect it to continue to amplify. So these are some of the culprits, are invasive grasses that are really shifting dynamics in drylands. Most of these are annual grass species from Eurasia or parts of Europe or Asia. And yeah, they can be extremely problematic. Climate change is thought to increase invasion by these. There's been a lot of studies that have looked at their distribution and seeing them growing and kind of starting to dominate parts of the West and becoming more abundant than native vegetation. But the ties to climate haven't been so tidy. They've been kind of correlative thoughts or ideas without really knowing if maybe it's just expanding in its range and we're just seeing it slowly fill its potential niche. So what I did is I actually used some of these germination models and conditions and modeled the likelihood of an annual grass species presence. This is with cheatgrass. And what I found was that the number of sites with cheatgrass, I looked at almost 3,000 sites or observations, and the likelihood of cheatgrass presence is increasing at low elevation, at mid elevation, but not at high elevation quite yet. There's probably some temperature and biotic barriers to its expansion there. But here we're seeing that these shifts in the seasons are really beneficial for an invasive annual grass that can grow during the winter and has a few different attributes than our natives. One problem with the invasives, probably the biggest problem, is our systems are not currently adapted to fire. So this is an ideal scenario in the Sonoran Desert where you see all of these plants, but you see bare space in between. it makes it really hard for a fire to carry across this landscape. So historically in the Sonoran, we're looking at a fire happening on average every 200 to 500 years. So really infrequent. There's a ton of time for the native community to bounce back. Like I said, they're slow movers, but these conservative growth strategies can come up over time before the next fire happens. Unfortunately, this is more of what it looks like now, especially as you go into the foothills. You see that these inner spaces are now filled with invasive grasses. So not only are these highly flammable, but they extend that fuel continuity across a landscape. And this can lead to more frequent fires, but also much larger fires. Here you can see it in the Mojave. It's really a shame. Once you learn about these, you never look at landscapes the same. I think that's probably every ecologist's plight is, wow, that's a beautiful photo. I sure wish it wasn't just filled with invasive species. So yeah, here you can see something similar. Spaces that would normally be bare are filled with invasive grasses. Here's an example of one on fire in the sagebrush steppe. Pretty easy to see how this can burn, whether that's human ignitions or through natural sources. And this really just transforms the West. It puts us into this feedback system where you have this conservative growth strategy that's kind of dominating. A fire happens, and the first thing that comes back is usually the acquisitive species, the annual grasses, the perennial grasses. Then slowly over time, we get the perennials, we get the conservative growth back. But if you speed up the fire cycle, you never reach that conservative growth. So you just kind of enter this loop and you never get back to kind of the native system that you know. Here's an example of fires in deserts. As you can see, a lot around here around Phoenix. If you pay attention to the colors, these yellow colors are more historic fires over much longer time frames, almost 50 years for these two categories. And what you see is lots of just really small fires, and they're obviously not happening very frequently. This image is really dominated by orange and red, which are fires that happened in the last 20 or 10 years. So these are bigger fires and they're more frequent, and we are not exempt to their effects here in the Sonoran. So with that, we can also expect higher variability in plant growth. So this is a drive that I used to take for some field work. And I was shocked year to year to see the difference in the landscape. We went from a rather desolate looking salt desert into a lush landscape that was so green. And this is largely due to an invasive mustard, an annual, and just explodes with variability. So I've already talked about how variability is high and increasing. Well, invasive species are looking to make that impact even larger on plant growth. So here's a study that I did looking specifically at sensitivity of plant communities. This is sensitivity to changes in rainfall. And on the x-axis, this is the average conditions of the site. So on the left side, really dry locations, on the right side, really wet locations. And we see that the dry locations are maybe a little bit more sensitive than the wet locations. But what happens after disturbance or after a fire, something that comes out and clears out and then lets the early successional species come in, we see that the sensitivity of these systems can magnify greatly, up to even 5 times as sensitive to interannual shifts in the amount of rainfall. So again, variability is going up. Here's a graph that I think I'll skip for just time's sake, but this just shows that this variability that happens after disturbance event is mostly explained by composition, shifts into those early successional acquisitive growth forms. So yeah, what is the future for plants in the American West? It does feel grim. I find that most roundtable discussions between managers and scientists talking about how do we deal with these problems often resort to preservation or conservation of areas that haven't been invaded already. There are some technologies out there that are looking to reduce invasives through herbicide or certain techniques. But this is a huge problem that we are really trying to fix and quite scared of. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge past collaborators and funders. Yeah, no scientist today can work alone. There's so much knowledge in so many areas you really need help. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Questions from the audience?
Did you see, did El Nino or those kind of I don't know what to call it, but did that come into play at all in some of the things you saw?
Yeah, so that's like a historic source of variability in the West is El Nino. And what they found is not that El Nino patterns are particularly strengthening or weakening. It's kind of it's really complicated to attribute whether it's like an overall variability that's shifting or if it's amplifying El Nino patterns, making them more frequent. There's not a great answer to that. I think some people are looking into it, but right now we are seeing this pattern both within and outside of El Nino years. So it contributes, but if it's fueled by these things, I couldn't quite tell you. Yes.
Yeah, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm wondering about the exotic invasives, especially here in the Sonoran Desert. What really are the best ways that we could combat them, at least their spread? I know like Central Arizona Conservation Alliance goes out and gets volunteers and they go and try to dig out buffalo grass, and then there's some application of herbicide that could happen to prevent it from coming back. And I'm just wondering, you know, is this a good strategy? Like, what is the best strategy? How would we, where would we even start to get
Yeah.
because it goes so far?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this. If it were an easy answer, I think we'd be making more progress than we have. Currently, there is some promise in certain seed-targeted herbicides, right? These annuals produce seeds in densities that are just crazy. I've seen metrics of up to 10,000 seeds produced in a square meter, which is just insane. So a lot of the success going forward is dealing with seeds, with propagule pressure. And that's limiting it from transferring areas, which they are very good at finding socks and staying in them and poking you at a different location. So you pull them out and throw them or whatever. So yeah, limited access to areas can help with spread. Land use, anytime we disturb a landscape, it pretty quickly fills with invasives. Seems like one of our best strategies is just to leave it alone and don't even try and interfere. But in places that are already invaded, there's thoughts of targeted grazing. So these acquisitive species, they turn green and they grow. Maybe you can get cattle or livestock on the site that are consuming what would become seeds and reduce the input. There's been some success with that. There's some herbicides that are pretty good. There's a new one called indaziflam that is thought to provide up to maybe 5 years of control from seeds. It's a seed-specific herbicide, so that can be really good for controlling invasives, but what happens to the natives, you know? And if you're doing this in a system that's already degraded, then you kind of turn it into a wasteland and you get erosion. So I think some combination of these different things might provide some progress. There are also people looking into microbes that you can put in, certain fungus that's more specific to these invasive species that are native to their home range. So I don't know. We might even just have to see how things play out over time. Maybe eventually things will kind of bounce back as more natural enemies and things start mounting against the invasive grasses.
So I'm hearing we need armies of goats.
It might work, you know. If you know somebody with goats, then we can start a study. I'm for it.
To start up.
Yeah.
I noticed on your fire map, I'm a little concerned about the Tonto Forest. So both in magnitude and recency, it seems like they're really concentrated right there. And my initial thought was, well, of course, it's next to this big urban area, and so you're getting a lot of goofballs just going up into the forest and making forest fires or whatever. But then I thought, all right, well, there was nothing around Las Vegas, so, or very little, it seems. So I guess is that a difference in just maybe elevation, the type of vegetation that's prone to spreading forest fires, or is there some other variable they're explaining that?
Yeah, so we have this interesting scenario where on, I'll call it the desert floor, these more open plains, we don't have quite as much problem with the invasive annuals. They want just a little bit more water. So as you move up into the foothills, they seem to reproduce much more successfully. And there's also a component that I didn't go into depth about, but with this more volatile hydrological cycle, you can get years of a lot of growth, explosive growth, followed by years of really dry conditions that kind of dry things out. And the foothills area that have native herbaceous stuff and also these invasives, it results in a lot of fuel there. So one, yes, there is more fuel in kind of foothills than the bottom of the desert, if you will. But yeah, proximity to potential human ignitions does play a role. In the Great Basin, especially, you see frequencies of fires, and when are they most abundant? July 4th. It's like a big spike. So that's in the Great Basin. Here in the Sonoran, I couldn't tell you for sure, but we do have some natural fires and some human ones. So I would expect an increase in these foothills like the Tonto National Forest, regardless of human activity, but especially since we have monsoons and lightning happening, but it's definitely amplified by human activity.
Just a question to piggyback on that. Are on that map that Chris was mentioning, are those all either human or
These are
naturally
both, yeah.
started, or is there any controlled burns listed here? And what is the role of controlled burns in any of this?
Yeah, so controlled burns, it's a good question. We don't like controlled burns so much in the desert scrub, like down below. They are currently kind of experimenting a little bit higher to see what this does. There's a lot of indication that a lot of Native American tribes were setting frequent small fires, and that's kind of the system that Westerners were introduced to when they came out and were like, oh, look at this pristine habitat. And so maybe we can get back by doing frequent small fires, but the new presence of the invasive that's come with the Western expansion
Hard to control.
is a factor that they didn't have to deal with as much in the past. So does it still work? Well, maybe in some habitats, maybe not in others. It becomes a little bit more complicated, but
So these are non-controlled burns.
these are non-controlled. I know for a fact in Tonto National Forest, I'm working with some natural resource managers up there, and they are now implementing prescribed fires, both within the national forest, and they're also partnering with neighboring tribe on some of their lands to see if we do a prescribed fire here, what happens. But this year they were set to do quite a few, and they said, you know what, it's too dry. If we do it now, the fires are going to be too big or out of control. So prescribed fire, question mark. I think that we're kind of trying to understand, as you go higher in elevation into wetter systems, prescribed fire can be great and the native systems come back pretty quickly. But as you get drier, it's becomes more of an unknown.
Can the native systems outcompete the non-native systems after a burn? Do you know? Is that no?
After a burn, usually we don't see it. Maybe on a longer time scale, if another fire didn't happen in 15 years, maybe we would start to see the native community slowly come back. And I've seen some data that suggest maybe 30 to 40 years after a fire, maybe that's when the native community finally starts making a little bit of progress. But the reburn frequency and size often don't let that happen.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so I spent a lot of time in Payson, and I know this past summer, there were some fires that were started, just like northeast of Payson, probably man-generated fires or whatever the term is. But the powers that be used those and sort of let them burn a little more, to have, you know, to take advantage of that. Yeah.
Be interesting to see how they play out.
I know, right? It's a weird gamble, but something that they tried.
Yeah, and I mean, the desert's slow. I did a study that was looking at recovery following disturbance. How long does it take for shrub communities to come back? And the average time was 70 to 100 years for most dryland systems. So to get back to where it was can take a while, maybe even longer. That's more of the average range was 70 to 100, but in certain environments may take even longer. So you gotta look at things with a really long looking vision.
Yeah, great. Well, welcome again to ASU.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. I really appreciate the focus on dry lands. You're in a really unique position, a unique university. You're based in life sciences and sustainability. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like, what do you like, you know, now that you're 3 months settled or however long, 4 months settled, I guess. Yeah. What are you most excited to do here and kind of leveraging your joint appointment and being at ASU?
Yeah, I think in the past I've been excited both by the general dryland ecology of plants, but then also this kind of restoration side that is more applied, correct? And I think that here I'm really excited to start looking a bit more at some solutions. I want to better identify why natives don't come back as well from fire. I'm also really interested in understanding if we're going to see as strong of a fire feedback loop in the Sonoran as we have seen in the Mojave and the Great Basin. So those are kind of two areas that I'm really interested in, but I'm also really curious into how we can improve post-fire restoration, and whether that be through, currently I'm doing some beta testing on this idea of planting juvenile plants with drones or from above. That could be a way to quickly replant following a fire or reach areas that are due to like topography or location may be difficult to do our current restoration approaches. So yeah, I'm kind of looking to mix the two, and I think it's nice because yeah, sustainability is all about kind of these partnerships and building a better world in a way. And I think that then the life sciences, I've got that ecological focus, and I think the two can come together really quite easily. And it excites me that I can maybe do something that would have an impact, right?
Which field sites do you think you'll be mostly continuing to work out or expand? Are you expanding field sites now that you're?
Yeah, so currently the plans are to partner with natural resource managers from BLM and Forest Service in Tonto National Forest. I've also been in contact and might be doing some things near the Dome Fire that occurred pretty close to Las Vegas, kind of on the border of Las Vegas and California. So that's more Mojave. I'm also, I now have been building some relationships with people at like Santa Rita experimental range down near Tucson, which is a nice blend of grama grasses and creosote and mesquite, and then also in the Jornada out by Las Cruces.
Thanks.
One more question?
Thank you for your presentation, and I have two questions. My first question is that as you said, how the plant responds to the higher temperature and the seasonal shift. And I'm wondering in climate change, and I'm wondering how plant responds to the uncertainty in climate change. And my second question is that when plants adapt to the climate change, do they behave like human, like backward agent, like they can learn from their history experience of climate change and memory of history climate change, or they can behave like sideward agent, like they can learn from other plants, or they can like forward agent, they can predict something.
Okay, yeah, good question. So yeah, as far as plants preparing for uncertain conditions, this is, I mean, they can't foresee anything, but they due to experience and evolved strategies, and then also the natural selection that occurs, I think that we'll see a response of increased abundance of conservative growth. So we'll see a shift towards more woody species, and also to annuals, maybe even a seed bank type style. So you can imagine something like the super bloom that happens in the Mojave. Like these seeds are sitting there for many years, and then a good year comes along and boom, comes to life. You see a lot of growth, a lot of reproduction as far as generating seeds and pollination, and then it sits again. So we might get this kind of a dynamic going forward, a blend of shrubland and annual plant dynamics. As far as can they learn from the past, there is evidence of maternal effects. Specifically, I know of maternal effects with seeds. Depending on the conditions, they will modify the germination timing of their seeds, potentially lengthening it or shortening it by modifying the amount of a hormone called abscisic acid. Yeah, so there are some things that can play a role, but I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure we know how well they can respond to these things, right? There's a level of adaptation that an individual can do, and then beyond that would be what we call evolution. And when does that begin? When have we reached the end of their adaptive capacity as an individual with their current genotype? I think those are cutting edge questions.
All right, we will end it. Sorry, it's already past 1, so I'm gonna wrap it up. If you wanna hang around after and answer some more questions, that'd be great. But this is our last one of the semester, so thank you everyone for coming. We're starting these in the fall, but hopefully you all come back for that. But thank you so much, Tyson. You might have had a question. Therefore, are you doing any running races soon? Or do you cover it too much in the summer? It's so hot.